The rain was not a weather event. It was a relentless, liquid weight that sought to drown the very spirit of the northern moors. Sarah Penhaligon stood at the edge of the ravine, her wool cloak heavy with the grey saturation of a storm that had already lasted 5 hours. She did not shield her eyes against the stinging gale. She did not lament the ruin of her only decent boots as they sank into the anaerobic pull of the black mud. Instead, she counted the seconds between the flashes of lightning and the thunder that followed, measuring the distance of the storm with the cold, mathematical precision her father had taught her before the world had turned its back on the Penhaligon name. Below her, in a jagged ditch carved by centuries of erosion, lay a mountain of black muscle and absolute terror. The stallion was worth more than the village that sat 3 miles to the east, though Sarah had no way of knowing the animal's pedigree or the astronomical price its owner had paid for its grace. To her, the creature was not a symbol of aristocratic vanity or a prize of the turf. It was a biological catastrophe in need of immediate stabilization. As a flash of white light split the sky, the horse's eye rolled back, showing a crescent of frantic white, a fevered, sightless gaze that signaled the onset of shock. She observed the angle of the left foreleg, which was twisted at a degree that defied natural alignment. The cannon bone had not merely snapped. It had been driven into the mire with the force of a high-speed gallop gone wrong. The young healer did not hesitate. She refused to let the freezing temperature of the runoff paralyze her intent. She descended the steep embankment, her fingers digging into the wet shale until her nails were torn and stained with the dark earth. When she reached the bottom, the stench of metallic blood and wet horsehair rose to meet her, thick and suffocating in the enclosed space of the ditch. The horse, a beast of nearly 16 hands, thrashed once, a desperate heave of its haunches that sent a spray of freezing mud across Sarah's face. She did not flinch. She placed a hand, firm, steady, and radiating a calm she did not entirely feel, directly upon the stallion's velvet muzzle. It was a matter of physics, not of emotion. To save the animal, she had to become the anchor in its world of pain. The stallion was not merely an animal. It was a shattered contract between life and the abyss. Sarah felt the heat radiating from the injured limb, a localized fire that spoke of a deep, systemic trauma. She began her assessment with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. Her fingers, though numb with cold, moved with a memory inherent to her bloodline, tracing the line of the fracture beneath the skin. There was a sickening heat there, a pulse that throbbed with the rhythm of a failing heart. The bone was fragmented, yet the skin remained largely intact, a small mercy that might prevent the deadly onset of sepsis if she acted within the hour. She took a length of sturdy hemp rope from her belt and began the delicate process of securing the stallion's head. She spoke no words of comfort. The animal would not understand the syntax of human pity. Instead, she hummed a low, vibrating note, a sound that mimicked the resonance of a mare's reassurance, while she calculated the leverage required to move 1,200 pounds of dying horse. It was an impossible task for a woman of her stature, yet Sarah Penhaligon was the daughter of a man who had been the finest equine surgeon in the north. She did not believe in the word impossible. She believed in the lever, the pulley, and the unwavering persistence of the human will. The struggle to move the beast from the ditch to the high ground of the Penhaligon stables took the better part of 3 hours. Sarah used the winch from the old well, a rusted iron relic that groaned under the strain, and a series of heavy canvas slings she had fashioned from old grain sacks. Each inch gained was a battle against gravity. Rain turned the slope into a slide of slick clay, and several times the stallion almost slipped back into the dark water. Sarah's breathing became a series of ragged, rhythmic gasps, her spine held as straight as a spear as she leaned her entire body weight into the rope. She did not falter. She wouldn't permit the darkness to swallow her resolve. When the stallion finally lay on the dry, albeit dusty, floor of her ruined stable, the moon was a pale, fractured ghost behind the clouds. The stable of Penhaligon Cottage was a monument to better days, its stone walls smelling of ancient hay, dried lavender, and the sharp, lingering scent of lye. It was a ruin. Yet, in the flickering light of a single tallow candle, it became a sanctuary of meticulous order. Sarah moved through the space with the economy of a ghost, her movements dictated by the rhythmic swinging of the pendulum on the mantel of the nearby cottage. She did not change her soaked clothes. She did not seek the warmth of the hearth. Her first action was to prepare a linseed wash, the seeds boiling in a small iron pot until the air was thick with a nutty, viscous aroma. She knelt beside the stallion, whom she now called simply the patient, and began the grueling task of cleaning the wound. The mud of the moor had to be removed with surgical precision, lest a single grain of grit remain to fester. She used a sponge of fine sea silk, dabbing at the matted black fur. As the layers of filth were stripped away, the true majesty of the horse revealed itself. The fine, thin skin of a thoroughbred, the powerful chest, and the intelligent, albeit exhausted, curve of its neck. It was a creature born for the speed of the hunt, now reduced to a shivering heap on a bed of straw. The procedure of checking for bone fragments was a quiet, personal craft of endurance. Sarah used a small silver probe, an heirloom from her father's kit that she kept polished to a mirror shine despite their poverty. She slid the metal into the swelling, her eyes closed, letting her sense of touch navigate the internal wreckage. She felt the jagged edges of the cannon bone, the sharp friction of calcium against muscle. Each movement caused the stallion to groan, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards. She did not apologize. She did not soften her touch. Precision was the only mercy she had to offer. Finding a splintered shard of bone near the artery, Sarah took a pair of thin, long-handled forceps. The candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. The horse's breathing was shallow and fast. She counted the respirations, 32 per minute, noting the dangerous rise of its internal temperature. If she did not remove the shard now, the artery would sever with the next involuntary twitch of the limb. She did not pray for steady hands. She simply willed them to be so. With a slow, deliberate inhalation, she clamped the forceps and withdrew the fragment. It was a sliver of white, no larger than a thorn, yet it carried the weight of the animal's life. Once the shard was removed, she began the application of the first poultice. This was not a simple bandage, but a complex chemical arrangement of comfrey, yarrow, and a tincture of willow bark, designed to draw the heat of the fever from the blood and stabilize the bone's alignment. She spread the green, herbal paste over the swollen leg, the texture like thick, cooling clay. The scent of crushed plants filled the stable, masking the odor of blood. She did not wrap the limb in silk. She used strips of heavy canvas. Tensioned with a series of wooden splints, she had carved herself from ash wood. The splints were not merely supports. They were the scaffolding of a future recovery. Throughout the night, the silence of the stable was broken only by the rhythmic chewing of the horse, as Sarah induced it to take a small amount of mash mixed with honey and ale. She watched the stallion's eyes, looking for the return of the pupil's contraction, the sign that the shock was receding. She sat on an upturned bucket, her hands resting on her knees, her posture as rigid as the stones of the manor. She did not sleep. She did not permit herself the luxury of exhaustion. Every 15 minutes, she checked the temperature of the poultice, feeling the heat being drawn out of the limb and into the adherbs. It was a slow, agonizingly technical process of restoration, a silent dialogue between the healer and the broken. By the time the first light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the stable roof, the stallion's breathing had slowed to a steady, deep cadence. The fever in its eyes had been replaced by a weary, hollow-eyed exhaustion, but the spark of life was no longer flickering on the edge of extinction. Sarah Penhaligon stood up, her joints popping with a sound like dry twigs, and surveyed the work of her hands. The horse was desperalized. The ledger of the night's labor showed a narrow, hard-won victory. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply took a clean bucket, walked to the well, and began the task of drawing water for the morning's tinctures. She remained entirely unaware that while she had spent the night in the mud and the straw, the most powerful man in the county had been scouring the moors with 50 riders, a duke whose grief for his lost companion had already turned into a cold, vengeful fury. To Sarah, the stallion was a patient, a collection of broken bones and fevered blood that required the stewardship of her intellect. She did not know she held Arthur St. Maur's heart in her stained, calloused hands. She only knew that the swelling on the cannon bone had subsided by half an inch, and in the world of Sarah Penhaligon, that was the only truth that mattered. She returned to the stable with the fresh water, the light of the rising sun catching the copper glint in her hair, which had escaped its pins during the night's exertion. She looked down at her dress, which was ruined beyond repair, caked in black northern clay and stained with the green of the poultice. It was a matter of labor, not of vanity. She would wash the dress as she would wash the horse, with methodical care and a total lack of complaint. As she began to prepare the next dose of the willow bark tincture, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats on the road, a rhythmic pounding that spoke of urgency and high-status riders. She did not look up. She did not stop her work. She simply tightened her grip on the silver-stirring spoon and continued to count the drops of the medicine, her spine perfectly straight against the coming storm of the world. The steam rising from the copper pot was a thick, herbal veil that carried the concentrated essence of 100 summers. Sarah Penhaligon stood in the cramped kitchen of the ruined cottage, the air smelling sharply of cider vinegar, crushed comfrey root, and the earthy, bitter musk of willow bark. She did not mind the heavy humidity that clung to her skin, nor did she seek the relief of a freezing draught from the open window. Instead, she monitored the simmering liquid, waiting for the precise moment when the viscosity changed from a watery infusion to a heavy, clinging syrup. It was a matter of chemistry, a silent, demanding science that left no room for the distractions of a tired mind. Her hands, though stained with the dark juices of the earth and the black mud of the northern moors, were steady. She reached for the heavy leather ledger, a thick bound book containing her father's meticulous notes on herbal tinctures and equine anatomy, which lay open on the scarred oak table. Its pages were weighted down by a smooth river stone. The old book was not a mere collection of medical observations. It was a kingdom of precise logic that the world of social cruelty could not invade. Her father, a disgraced veterinarian, had been a man of few words but infinite observations. He had understood the knitting of bone as if it were a language he had invented himself, and Sarah Penhaligon had inherited his fluency. She examined the hand-drawn diagrams of a horse's leg, tracing the lines of force and tension that dictated the animal's survival. The ink was faded, brown at the edges, but the authority of the strokes remained absolute. She did not allow the shadow of his disgrace to dim the clarity of her focus. She did not dwell on the night the local gentry had stripped him of his position, or the way the village had turned its back when false accusations began to fly. To Sarah, her father's ledger was the only truth that remained. The world outside might run on gossip, on the whims of lords and the cruelty of the peerage. But inside the pages of that book, the rules were governed by biology and discipline. She measured out a small amount of honey, guided by the precise instructions left behind in the familiar handwriting, and watched as it vanished into the swirling amber of the tincture. She felt the reassuring weight of a silver probe, an heirloom from her father's veterinary kit used for careful assessment, tucked safely in her pocket. It represented her true inheritance, the animal in the stable. A prize-winning black thoroughbred stallion with a shattered cannon bone and a fevered eye was a biological debt that Sarah had determined to pay in full. She understood that his life hung on the balance of her internal audit, a tally of symptoms and responses that she updated every hour. She felt a cold satisfaction as the mixture finally thickened. The scent changed to a deep, soothing aroma that promised the drawing out of heat from the limb. The horse did not know the name of its savior, and Sarah did not know the name of its owner. She only knew the strict requirements of the anatomy. The comfrey poultice, a specific labor-intensive herbal mixture used to draw heat from the horse's fractured limb, was finally ready. She wiped her hands on a coarse linen cloth, the fabric rough against her skin. The cottage around her was a monument to neglect. The plaster was peeling from the walls in long, pale strips, and the hearthstones were cracked from years of freezing winters. Yet in this room, there was an order that defied the ruin. Every jar was labeled in her neat, upright script. Every tool was polished until it gleamed like a piece of captured starlight against the grey dust. She had transformed the wreckage of Penhaligon Cottage into a fortress of quiet competence. She did not hear the gate groan on its rusted hinges, nor did she notice the sudden silence of the birds until a shadow fell across the threshold. Sarah did not startle. She did not drop the silver-stirring spoon. She simply tilted her head, her spine assuming the rigid vertical line that was her only defense against the intrusions of the outside world. Thomas Miller stood in the doorway, his cap gripped tightly in both hands, his face a landscape of deep anxiety. He was a loyal but weary groom who had once worked alongside Sarah's father, and he carried with him the familiar smell of damp wool and old stables. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the bubbling pot, then at the young woman whose hair was a tangled crown of copper in the morning light, and finally at the meticulous notes of the open ledger. There was a flicker of profound recognition in his eyes, a memory of a time when the name Penhaligon meant the difference between a prize mare living or dying. To him, the sight of the open book was both a comfort and a terrifying omen. Sarah Penhaligon did not offer him a seat. She continued to stir the tincture, her eyes fixed entirely on the thick liquid, a matter of action, not of emotion. She could see the trembling in Miller's rough hands, the way his boots shifted uneasily against the stone floor. "You have brought the weather in with you, Miller," she observed quietly, her voice entirely devoid of panic. Miller cleared his throat, the sound rough and full of the grit of the road. He spoke in a low, urgent tone, his words tumbling over each other. He told her that the valley was crawling with riders. From the great estates, their horses lathered with sweat and their eyes sharp with a desperation born of absolute fear. The moors, usually silent and empty, were echoing with the shouts of men who were hunting for a ghost. He spoke of Bellerophon, a black stallion whose name was whispered in the local taverns like a living myth. The horse, Miller claimed, was the most precious possession of the Duke, master of the sprawling manor. The animal was a champion whose value exceeded the combined wealth of 10 neighboring villages. Arthur St. Maur was not a man to lose things, and the disappearance of this prized animal had transformed the valley into a landscape of focused rage. To the wealthy riders, the horse was a fortune on 4 legs. To Miller, it was a sudden threat to anyone caught standing in its path. Sarah did not flinch when Miller mentioned the massive reward, a sum of gold that could have easily bought her a new life and a house far from the reach of her father's ghost. She asked about the riders, her voice perfectly level. Miller told her that Lord Percival Thorne was leading the local militia, a man whose vast social ambition was matched only by his complete lack of equestrian knowledge. Thorne was arrogantly scouring the ravines, loudly convinced that no animal could survive a fall into the black mire of the northern moors during a midnight storm. Thorne did not care for the animal's life. He cared only for the opportunity to play the hero in the eyes of the distant, powerful Duke. The weary groom leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that barely rose above the crackle of the hearth fire. He warned her that they were coming directly to the Penhaligon cottage stables. Geoffrey Higgins, the Duke's high-strung valet, was riding alongside Thorne, obsessed with protocol and the immediate safe return of his master's property. They were checking every stable, every shed and every tenant's ruined hovel within a 5-mile radius of the estate boundary. Miller looked toward the heavy wooden door that led to the attached, ruined stable where the stallion lay in his bed of fresh straw. He did not ask if the horse was hidden there, he did not need to. The sharp scent of the comfrey root and the sight of the father's ledger were evidence enough for a man who knew the silent language of the Penhaligon family. "They will not simply ask questions," Miller whispered, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "Lord Thorne is looking for someone to blame. He will see a thief, Sarah. He will not see a nurse." Sarah refused to look for a convenient excuse. She met the eyes of the frightened groom, with a gaze that was as steady and unyielding as the ancient stones of the moor. She told him that the horse was simply not fit to travel. She spoke clinically of the shattered cannon bone, the dangerous fever that had only just broken, and the delicate scaffolding of the timber supports that held the animal's future together. To move the massive stallion now would be to undo the painstaking labor of the night. It would destroy the fragile alignment she had achieved. It was a matter of medical necessity, not of aristocratic ownership. Miller looked at her with a mixture of profound awe and cold terror. He knew the strict laws of the land, which clearly defined a poor woman's interference with a powerful nobleman's property as a severe offense. He saw her ruined dress, her ink-stained fingers, and the unbending straightness of her spine. He realized that Sarah was not a girl who understood the concept of social surrender. She was a silent architect who was building her own kingdom out of the scattered debris of a ruined name. He told her that Lord Percival Thorne would never listen to the logic of bone and sinew. Thorne would see only the injured horse and the poor girl who had taken him, using both to aggressively secure his own standing with the estate's lord. The Duke was a man of immense power, a figure who rarely descended from the heights of his vast domain unless provoked, and he had been profoundly provoked. Sarah did not respond to the open threat. She did not calculate the risk of the magistrate's wrath or the heavy weight of the law's judgment. She moved gracefully to the table and closed the heavy ledger, the sound of the thick leather cover meeting the parchment like a judge's gavel, striking a wooden bench. The sound echoed in the small room, finalizing her decision. She looked directly at Miller and told him to go back to the search party. She told him to tell the frantic riders that the treacherous Moors had swallowed the stallion whole, that the black mud had taken what the great house had failed to protect. It was a silent, private art of survival. She would keep the secret until the horse could stand. She would not surrender a patient to a mob of ignorant men who valued a title more than a life. The old groom lingered for a long moment, his anxious eyes darting to the stable door and back to the young woman who stood as an immovable sentinel. He saw the quiet, terrifying determination in her face, a resilience he had not seen since her brilliant father had been driven from the county in disgrace. He finally realized that Sarah was not hiding a stolen horse. She was ferociously defending her work. She was reclaiming the dignity that the village had stripped from her family. He nodded once, heavily, acknowledging the unbreakable nature of her will. He backed slowly out of the warm kitchen, pulling his cap down low over his brow. He vanished into the cold light of the morning, his rapid footsteps fading down the muddy lane until there was nothing left but the steady ticking of the timepiece on the mantelpiece. Sarah was completely alone again, but the heavy silence in the cottage had changed its texture. The threat of Lord Percival Thorne hung in the air like the promise of winter frost. She did not hurry her movements. She did not allow the sudden urgency of Miller's terrifying warning to ruin the meticulous quality of her work. Panic was a luxury she could not afford, an emotion that clouded the strict mathematics of healing. She took a clean glass jar from the wooden shelf and began decanting the dark tincture, the golden liquid flowing with a slow, heavy grace she would absolutely not hide. She would finish the nursing of the injured stallion with the methodical precision that was her birthright, regardless of who the beast belonged to in the great ledger of the law. If the men of the great house wished to reclaim their prize, they would have to step into her domain and respect her rules. She thought briefly of His Grace, the owner of the horse, a man she imagined as a distant creature of high formal protocols. They were both desperately trying to impose order on a world that constantly sought to break what was fast and beautiful. Yet she worked quietly in the dirty straw, using her hands to mend what the storm had shattered, while the master worked with shouting riders on the high moors, relying on the blunt force of wealth and authority. The fleeting thought of the Duke was quickly eclipsed by the immediate, practical needs of the fractured bone. He was merely an abstract concept. The horse was a living reality. She took the warm jar of medicine, along with a bundle of fresh linen, and walked purposefully toward the stable door, her steps paced to the steady beating of the timepiece. The heavy wooden door yielded to her push, opening into a dim, quiet sanctuary where the sharp scent of lavender met the warm, familiar smell of the horse. The ruined stable was drafty, but she had constructed a barrier of old canvas to block the worst of the wind. Bellerfin turned his massive head slightly as she entered, his dark ears flickering at the sound of her approach. His large eye was clear, the dangerous fever finally gone, but a profound exhaustion remained in the heavy droop of his neck. Sarah knelt gracefully beside his injured leg, the damp straw soaking into the hem of her skirts. She paid it no mind. Her nimble fingers moved to the tight ties of the canvas splints, her touch light but immensely confident. She would carefully change the poultice and closely monitor the pulse in the damaged limb. The magnificent stallion was not a prize to be won or a fortune to be hoarded. It was a matter of restorative action, not of human emotion. She began to unwrap the soiled bandages, her gentle movements acting as a silent, respectful dialogue with the fragile bone beneath the skin. The carved wooden braces held firm, perfectly mirroring the structural integrity outlined in the old ledger. She did not know that the desperate riders were already turning their exhausted horses toward the thin column of smoke rising from her chimney. She did not know that Geoffrey Higgins was leading Lord Percival Thorne directly toward the boundary line of Penhaligon cottage. She only knew that the dangerous swelling in the black leg was down by another crucial fraction of an inch. The cruel world could come for her with its judgments and its arrogant demands, but it would simply have to wait until she had finished the restoration of the king who lay in the straw. Her spine remained perfectly straight, her focus absolute, as she applied the warm comfrey to the cooling skin. The work was everything. The work was her kingdom. The stillness of the stable was a brittle thing. Vibrating with the frequency of the stallion's labored breathing, Sarah knelt in the damp straw, her fingers tracing the black hock with the lightness of a weaver assessing a snag. The swelling of the cannon bone had subsided, but as she moved her hand toward the joint, she felt a localized heat. It was a sharp, pulsating radiation. Beneath the velvet skin of the thoroughbred, a secondary pocket of stagnant fluid had formed. This was a dark byproduct of the trauma that the comfrey poultice could not reach. To the untrained eye, it was a mere bruise. To Sarah, the daughter of a disgraced veterinarian, it was the silent herald of a septic crisis. She refused to allow the discovery to destabilize her breathing. She spent no time lamenting the cruelty of a healing process that demanded 2 steps back for everyone forward. Instead, she stood, her spine as vertical as the timber beams supporting the roof, and began a mental audit of her father's kit. The infection was deep, tucked behind heavy tendons where blood flow was restricted. If she did not drain the pressure within the hour, the poison would migrate to the bone, and the magnificent Bellerophon would be dead by morning. It was a matter of surgical intervention, not of herbal patience. Sarah walked back into the cottage kitchen, the floorboards groaning beneath her measured pace. The fire in the hearth was a low orange glow of banked embers, casting long, wavering shadows across the scarred oak table. Here, her father's heavy leather ledger still lay open. The diagrams remained unconsulted. She had no need of them. The geometry of the procedure was burned into her mind like a brand. She reached for the iron cautery, a specialized tool with a thin tip and a heavy wooden handle. It was an object of cold, silver-gray steel. Beneath the influence of the fire, it would become the only weapon capable of cutting through the stallion's agony. She placed the tip of the iron directly into the heart of the embers, watching the metal absorb the heat. Her gaze never faltered. She watched the steel move through shades of dull red, then a vibrant orange, until it glowed with white-hot intensity. This was not an act of destruction. It was a purification of the flesh. The iron was not an instrument of torment. It was a calculated contract with survival. She waited until the metal reached the exact shade of sun-bleached bone. Returning to the stable, she carried the glowing iron in a ceramic vessel, heat radiating from it like a captive star. The scent of wood smoke and hot metal preceded her, causing the stallion to roll his eye in instinctive fear. Words of empty comfort were beneath her. She simply placed her shoulder against his massive chest, anchoring him against the stall. She counted his heartbeats, 52 per minute, noting the sharp acceleration as he sensed the proximity of the heat. With a decisive movement, she applied the iron. The sound was an aggressive hiss, followed immediately by the pungent scent of singed hair and boiled sap. A plume of white steam rose, curling around her face. The stallion gave a guttural groan, his body shuddering with a force that nearly threw her into the straw. His leg remained trapped in her firm grip. Her resolve did not waver. She did not pull the tool away until the pressure was released, and the stagnant fluid hissed against the heat. It was a surgical audit of the body's resistance. When she withdrew the iron, the pocket had been drained and the wound sealed by the fire. She sat back on her heels, her forehead damp with sweat, replacing the cautery in its vessel. The stallion's breathing was a series of ragged snorts, but the frantic heat in the limb had begun to dissipate. The ledger of his recovery was back in balance. She allowed herself no such luxury as a trembling hand. She stood, smoothed the front of her ruined dress, and began preparing a fresh wrap of linen, governed by the passage of minutes. The work was interrupted by a low, urgent whistle from the stable entrance. Thomas Miller, The weathered groom who had once served her father stepped into the shadows. His face was etched with a grim anxiety that mirrored the storm-tossed moors outside. "Sarah," Miller whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of a long ride. "Lord Percival Thorne and Geoffrey Higgins are at the southern boundary. They are leading a search party for the Duke's stallion. Higgins is convinced the beast is dead, but Thorne is looking for an excuse to seize your land. If they find that horse in this condition, they will call it theft and shoot the animal where it lies." A cold weight settled in her chest, but her expression remained as impassive as stone. She looked at Bellerophon, whose life was currently held together by ash wood splints and her own stubborn will. "He cannot be moved, Miller," she said levelly. "To transport him now would be to shatter the cannon bone beyond repair. He would be dead before they reached the moorland estate." "Then hide him," Miller urged, glancing toward the lane. "Thorne values the horse's price, not its life. If he sees those splints, he will claim you have ruined a masterpiece." Hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. It was a matter of survival, not of sentiment. She directed Miller to help her drag heavy burlap sacks and rusted farm equipment in front of the stall, creating a makeshift screen of domestic neglect. She scattered dry straw over the blood-stained floor and moved her father's veterinary kit into a hollowed-out floorboard. "Tell them you saw nothing on the North Road," she commanded. "I will provide the distraction. If they enter this yard, I shall be a simple woman tending a kitchen fire, unaware of any missing dukes or their property." Miller nodded, his respect for her clinical composure evident in the way he touched his cap before disappearing into the mist. Sarah returned to the kitchen and began to boil a pot of bitter willow bark, the pungent steam acting as a sensory veil to mask the cauterized wound. She sat by the hearth, her father's old ledger closed on her lap, and waited. 3 days passed in a state of high-stakes siege. The search parties, led by Geoffrey Higgins, circled the cottage like wolves. Sarah met every inquiry with a quiet, terrifying dignity that discouraged closer inspection. She lied with the precision of a bookkeeper, accounting for every hour with mundane details of estate management. In the dark of night, she continued the restoration. She adjusted the splints, she applied the comfrey. She watched as the stallion began to bear the smallest fraction of weight on his leg. It was on the 17th day of this private war. A day when the fog hung thick enough to taste of wet wool. That the sound of a lone horse and carriage reached the yard. This was not the rhythmic pounding of the militia, nor the frantic arrival of Miller. It was a deliberate cadence, a carriage navigating the ruts with a groaning lack of grace. She did not rush to the door. She waited until the final tie on the stallion's fresh bandage was secure. Only then did she step out into the yard, her spine assuming its habitual, rigid alignment. The man in the threshold was not Thorne, nor was he a common laborer. He was a figure of restrained wealth, wrapped in a heavy traveling cloak of charcoal wool. His boots were caked in black mud, and his eyes were a shade of winter grey that seemed to audit the world with a single glance. The titled gentleman did not bear the aspect of a duke in that moment. He looked like a man broken by the elements. "The driver stays with the wreck," the stranger said, his melodic baritone carrying the resonance of authority. "My carriage has lost a wheel on the ravine road, and I found myself following the smoke of your chimney. I seek only a moment of shelter and, perhaps, the use of a stable for a horse that can no longer pull its weight." The customary curtsy remained unperformed. Sarah stood her ground, the silver probe still tucked into her apron pocket, her gaze meeting his with level equality. She observed the way he avoided looking directly at the stable, yet his eyes kept returning to the building with a focus that was almost painful. "The stable is occupied, sir," she observed, levelly, "and as you can see, I am in the midst of a procedure that cannot be interrupted by the requirements of a broken carriage. If you seek shelter, the cottage kitchen is warm." Arthur moved into the stable, his steps cautious. He did not ask for permission. He walked toward the stall where Bellerophon lay, his gaze fixed on the surgical site the girl had recently tended. He saw the ceramic vessel, the meticulous arrangement of the ash wood splints, and the faint scent of medicinal herbs. "You have used a hot iron on this animal," the Duke said, his voice vibrating with sudden intensity. "Who gave you the authority to perform such a procedure on a beast of this quality?" She held her ground, stepping between the man and the horse. Her straight spine acted as a physical barrier. She looked him directly in the eye, her posture radiating quiet sovereignty. "Authority is granted by the necessity of the anatomy, sir," she replied. Her words clipped. The animal had a pocket of stagnant fluid that would have turned to sepsis before the moon rose. "I have not brutalized him. I have saved the structural integrity of his hock. If you are a man who understands horses, you will see the drop in the inflammation. If you are not, then your opinion on the matter is of no consequence to the horse or to me. You—" The stranger froze, the shock of her bluntness visible in the sudden tension of his jaw. He was a man whose word was law, yet here was a woman in a ruined dress who spoke of biology as if it were the only true peerage. He looked from her soot-smudged face to the stallion. He saw the way Bellerophon's ears flickered toward the girl, the way his breathing had stabilized into a rhythmic cadence. He realized, with a cold shiver of recognition, that the woman did not know who he was. She did not know that the black thoroughbred she had just seared was his prized stallion. She treated him with a dignified indifference centered entirely on the work. To her, the horse was a patient and he was an interruption. "I am a man who understands horses," Arthur said softly, the anger in his voice replaced by profound curiosity. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined the ledger that sat on an upturned crate. "And I have never seen anyone handle a cautery iron with such mathematical certainty. Many practitioners would have called for the pistol the moment they saw the fracture. They listened to the price of the animal and the inconvenience of the recovery." Sarah countered, her hands returning to the task of cleaning her tools. "I do not care for the price. I care for the restoration of what was broken." She did not invite him to stay. She simply began to polish the silver probe with a piece of dry linen. The visitor stood in the shadows, his cloak damp and heavy, watching her work. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by the high formal protocols of the moorland estate, by women who fainted at the sight of a scratch. In this ruined stable, he had found something he had not known existed, a competence so pure it was a form of power. He decided he would not reveal his identity. He wanted to see the end of this miracle. He wanted to know how a woman with nothing but a ruined cottage could achieve what the royal veterinarians had declared impossible. "It seems the storm has left us both stranded," the Duke said, his voice level once more. "If you will permit it, I shall stay in the kitchen until the morning light. Perhaps I can assist with the heavy lifting if the work requires it." Sarah did not look up. She simply nodded once, a gesture of cold professional acceptance. "The lifting is done for the hour," she observed, "but the water must be kept boiling for the tinctures. If you wish to stay, you must make yourself useful to the patient. The requirements of the blood are the same, whether for a duke's horse or a beggar's pony. Do not forget that, sir." Arthur bowed slightly, a gesture of genuine respect entirely out of place in the dirty straw. He did not know that his search party was nearby. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he was merely an observer in the kingdom of Sarah Penhaligon. The stable settled into an ordered silence, measured by the rhythmic chiming of the hours and the steady healing breath of the king in the straw. Her father's ledger was open, and the world outside was finally held at bay. The kitchen of Penhaligon Cottage was not a place of domestic comfort. It was a laboratory of cold, herbal necessity. The scent of simmering willow bark was a thick, bitter ribbon that wound around the rafters, competing with the sharp metallic tang of the silver medical instruments resting on a linen cloth. Sarah Penhaligon stood by the hearth, her posture as unyielding as the iron spit. She did not look at the man sitting at her scarred oak table. She did not offer the nobleman the hospitality of small talk or the warmth of a forced smile. Instead, she monitored the rhythm of the bubbling copper pot, her mind calculating the reduction of the tincture with the precision of a master clockmaker. To her, the man known to the world as the Duke of Moorland was merely a variable in an already complex equation, a set of shoulders for lifting and a pair of eyes that observed too much. Arthur St. Maur sat in the flickering amber light, his charcoal cloak draped over the back of a spindly chair. He watched the woman move. Sarah did not scurry. She did not perform the frantic, nervous gestures of a peasant in the presence of a superior. Every step Sarah took was a measurement of the floorboards. Every reach for a jar of dried lavender was a testament to the economy of motion. Arthur had spent his life in ballrooms where movement was a decorative art, but in this ruined kitchen, He was witnessing movement as a survival strategy. He felt the weight of his own silence, a heavy, unaccustomed pressure in his chest, as he realized that for the first time in 30 years, his title carried no more weight than the soot on the chimney. "You look at the horse as if he were a cathedral," the Duke observed quietly, his melodic baritone cutting through the hiss of the steam. "Most men see a beast of burden or a prize of the turf. You see something else entirely." Sarah did not turn her head. She picked up a wooden spoon and stirred the amber liquid, her eyes fixed on the vortex of the pot. A matter of action, not of emotion. She allowed the silence to stretch, measured by the rhythmic ticking of the mantelpiece dial, before she spoke. Her voice was level, a clinical instrument that stripped the sentiment from the air. "A cathedral is a matter of stone and prayer, sir," Sarah replied, her words clipped and formal. "A horse is a matter of geometry and tensile strength. If one understands the architecture of the skeleton, one understands the limits of the soul. The stallion is not a monument. He is a structure of levers and pulleys that has been violently disrupted. To restore him is not a prayer. It is a calculation of the bone's ability to bear the weight of its own history." Arthur leaned forward, his grey eyes narrowing in the firelight. He had heard the finest surgeons in London speak of the body, yet they had never spoken with this terrifying clarity. They spoke of humours and vapours. Sarah Penhaligon spoke of physics. He saw the way she touched the silver probe on the table, her fingers lingering on the cold metal as if it were an extension of her own nervous system. "The geometry of the cannon bone," Arthur mused, testing the weight of the phrase. "You speak as though the fracture is a mathematical error that can be corrected with enough logic." "It is precisely that," Sarah said, finally, turning to face him. Her spine was a perfect vertical line against the backdrop of the peeling plaster. "The bone failed because the force exceeded the structural integrity of the calcium. My task is to create a scaffold, both internal and external, that allows the biology to reassert its own order. It is a slow, solitary discipline of endurance. It requires a patient who is still, and a healer who does not blink." She walked toward the stable door, her movements graceful, despite the ruined state of her bombazine dress. Sarah did not invite him to follow, yet Arthur found himself rising, drawn by the gravity of her competence. They entered the dim sanctuary of the stable, where the scent of warm horsehair and lavender was a physical presence. Bellerophon, the black stallion, lay in his bed of straw, his ears flickering towards Sarah with a trust that Arthur had never seen him grant to another human being. To the Duke, the horse was a symbol of his power, a living testament to the St. Maur lineage. To the woman kneeling in the straw, the horse was a problem of alignment. Sarah placed her hand on the stallion's neck. She did not pet him. She did not offer the soft, meaningless coos of a girl with a pet. She pressed her palm against the carotid artery, counting the pulse against the ticking of her internal clock. Arthur watched from the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the way she looked at the injured leg, the ashwood splints holding firm, the comfrey poultice drawing out the last of the heat. "He is standing in his mind already," Sarah whispered, a rare flicker of intensity in her gaze. "The geometry is holding, but the night is the enemy of the mend. The cold causes the muscles to contract, and a single involuntary spasm could shatter the progress of a week. We must be the anchors tonight, sir. If you are to stay, Arthur, you must hold the weight of his fear so that I may hold the weight of his bone." Arthur stepped into the straw, the fine wool of his trousers meeting the damp earth. He did not care about the ruin of his clothes. He did not care about the protocol that forbade a peer of the realm from kneeling in the dirt. He reached out and took the stallion's head, his hands steady, mirroring Sarah's resolve. For a moment, the high formal world of the Duke's domain vanished, replaced by the primitive, urgent reality of the stable. They were two architects of a fragile peace, working in the silence of the northern night to keep a king from falling. The moon ascended over the moors, a cold, silver eye that watched the cottage from the height of a pitiless sky. Inside the stable, the temperature dropped until their breath hung in the air like ghostly veils. She didn't seek the warmth of the cottage. She did not permit herself the luxury of a chair. She remained on the floor, her hands perpetually moving over the stallion's limbs, monitoring the micro-shifts of the muscle. Every 30 minutes, She checked the tension of the canvas wraps. Every hour she administered a small dose of the willow bark tincture, the golden liquid disappearing into the horse's muzzle with a soft, rhythmic sound. Arthur St. Maur sat opposite her, his back against the rough timber of the stall. He watched Sarah through the haze of exhaustion, his mind auditing the scene with a growing sense of wonder. He saw the ink-stained fingers that moved with the delicacy of a lacemaker. He saw the straightness of her spine, a physical manifestation of a dignity that no poverty could erode. He realized that Sarah was not a victim of her father's disgrace. She was the steward of his genius. She had taken the ruins of a reputation and forged them into a weapon of pure skill. The crisis arrived at the stroke of midnight. The stallion's breathing suddenly shifted from a deep, steady cadence to a sharp, ragged whistle. Sarah's hand shot to the hock. She did not gasp, she did not cry out. She simply felt the sudden, violent throb of a septic pulse. "The pressure has returned," Sarah said, her voice a sharp blade in the silence. "The cauterization has held, but a deeper pocket of fluid is pressing against the nerve. If he thrashes now, the splints will fail." The stallion's body heaved, a massive, involuntary shudder that sent a spray of straw into the air. His eyes rolled back, the white crescents of terror returning with a vengeance. Arthur gripped the horse's head, his muscles straining against the 1,200 pounds of panicked black muscle. "Hold him, Arthur," Sarah commanded, her voice rising with a terrifying authority. "Do not let the neck arch. Exert your weight, sir. Use every ounce of strength you have." The Duke did not hesitate. Arthur threw his entire body across the stallion's chest, his face inches from the flared, hot nostrils. He felt the raw power of the animal, the sheer, terrifying force of a creature that knew it was dying. He did not look away. Arthur anchored his boots against the floorboards, his teeth gritted against the strain. Sarah did not look for a gentle solution. She reached for the silver probe, her movements a flash of cold, surgical intent. She did not pray. She did not hesitate. Sarah Penhaligon slid the metal into the joint, finding the exact millimeter of the obstruction. With a slow, deliberate pressure, she bypassed the tendon and breached the pocket. A dark, foul-smelling fluid hissed out, meeting the straw with a sickening sound. The stallion gave one final, guttural groan and then went limp, the tension draining from his body like water from a breached dam. His head came to rest in Arthur's lap, the frantic rhythm of his heart slowing to a manageable throb. Arthur remained where he was, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his charcoal cloak stained with the fluids of the procedure. He looked up at Sarah. Sarah was sitting back on her heels, the silver probe in her hand, her face a mask of absolute, clinical exhaustion. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply wiped the instrument on a clean cloth and looked at the clock. 12 minutes past the hour, Sarah observed quietly. "The pressure is gone. The geometry is restored. He will sleep now." Arthur looked down at the horse's head, then back at the woman who had just performed a miracle in the dark. He saw the soot on her cheek and the fierce, unyielding pride in her eyes. The stallion was not a creature of flesh in that moment. He was a problem of structural integrity that Sarah had solved with the blunt force of her intellect. "You are a formidable woman, Sarah Penhaligon," the Duke said, his voice thick with a respect that transcended his station. "There are men in the Royal Veterinary College who would have fled this room an hour ago. You did not even flinch." "Flinching is a luxury of the idle, sir," Sarah replied, her voice returning to its habitual level tone. "A horse does not care for the delicacy of one's nerves. He only cares for the steady hand. I have a duty to the bone, and the bone does not accept apologies." Sarah stood up, her joints popping with a sound like dry twigs, and began to arrange the tools for the morning's cleaning. She did not ask Arthur if he was tired. She did not offer him a place to rest. Sarah simply moved through the stable, restoring order to the wreckage of the crisis. Arthur watched her, his own exhaustion forgotten. He realized that he was no longer looking for his horse. He was looking at the woman who had saved it. He was looking at a creature of such profound competence that the entire hierarchy of the Regency world seemed like a childish fiction in her presence. "The water will be cold by now," Sarah said, her back to him. "I shall start the fire for the morning tinctures. If you wish to be of further use, Arthur, you must watch the breathing, count the inhalations. If they rise above 20 per minute, you are to call me immediately. Do not sleep, sir. Stewardship does not permit it." The esteemed Lord of Moorland sat in the damp straw of a ruined stable and began to count. He did not feel the cold. He did not feel the indignity of his position. He only felt the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of the horse beneath his hand and the terrifying, magnificent presence of the woman in the next room. The ledger of his life was being rewritten in the silence of the Penhaligon stables, one breath at a time. The world outside, with its dukedoms and its search parties and its arrogant lords, was a distant, fading memory. Here, in the shadows, there was only the work, the bone, and the quiet, personal method of persisting. Arthur was no longer a master searching for his property. He was a student of a lady who owned nothing but her mind and the straightness of her spine. And in the ordered silence of the dawn, he realized that he had never been more truly seen. The 28th morning was not announced by the sun, but by the cessation of a fevered hope. The light that filtered through the cracks in the Penhaligon stable roof was a pale surgical grey, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the cold air like tiny, silent witnesses. Sarah Penhaligon stood before the stall of the black thoroughbred, her hands resting at her sides, her fingers motionless. She did not move with the haste of someone seeking a conclusion. She did not allow the weight of the month's labor, the sleepless nights, the stained fingers, the constant, low-burning anxiety, to bow the perfect vertical line of her spine. Instead, she stood in a state of calculated observation, her eyes auditing the way the stallion shifted his weight in the straw. The stallion was not merely a prize of the turf. He was a kingdom that Sarah had rebuilt with the precision of a master architect. To the world, he was Bellerophon, a piece of property. To Sarah, he was a masterpiece of geometry that was finally ready for its final stress test. Arthur St. Maur stood in the shadows near the tack room, his charcoal cloak wrapped tightly around his shoulders to ward off the damp northern chill. He had not slept in the cottage for 3 days, preferring the hard, cold reality of the stable floor where he could monitor the rhythm of the horse's recovery. He watched Sarah with a focus that was no longer born of aristocratic concern for his property. He watched her as a student watches a master. He saw the way the morning light caught the copper in her hair and the deep, ink-stained shadows beneath her eyes, yet her movements remained as precise as a geometric proof. He realized that the woman before him did not require his wealth or his title to define her existence. She existed in the work. She existed in the cold, secluded practice of preservation that had kept this animal alive against every law of nature and every prediction of the Royal Veterinary College. "The time for the scaffolding has ended," Sarah said, her voice a level, melodic instrument in the quiet of the dawn. She did not turn to look at Arthur, though she knew exactly where he stood. The ash wood splints have served their purpose as a surrogate for the bone's integrity. To keep them on longer would be to invite the muscle to forget its own duty. Today, the biology must stand on its own merits. She knelt in the straw, the fabric of her ruined dress whispering against the ground. She reached for the small silver blade she had used for the dressings, its edge kept keen and bright. With the economy of a ghost, she began to cut the heavy canvas ties. She did not tear at them. She did not rush the process. She unspooled the layers of linen with a rhythmic deliberation, her hands moving through the crust of dried comfrey and willow bark as if she were uncovering a hidden sculpture. The scent of the stable, the sweet hay, the sharp lye, and the earthy musk of the horse seemed to intensify as the final layer of the poultice was removed. The air was thick with the smell of old herbs and the metallic tang of the morning frost. Arthur held his breath, his hands clenched at his sides. He saw the black skin of the leg emerge from the bandages. It was lean, the swelling entirely gone, the lines of the tendons appearing as sharp and defined. As the strings of a harp, there was no sign of the jagged fracture that had once threatened to sever the stallion's future. The cauterized site was a small, clean mark, a silver-grey memory of the fire Sarah had used to save him. It was a miracle of restoration, achieved in a drafty stable, with nothing but a leather-bound ledger and a mind that refused to accept defeat. "I have seen the finest horses in England," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with a profound, unscripted respect, "and I have seen them ruined by lesser injuries than this. What you have done, Sarah, transcends the skills of any man I have ever employed. You have not just mended a bone, you have restored the very architecture of his grace." Sarah did not look up for the applause. She did not seek the validation of the man who owned the animal. She placed her hand firmly on the stallion's shoulder, her touch an anchor in his world of sudden lightness. She spoke no words of encouragement. Instead, she applied a steady downward pressure, signaling the horse to shift his center of gravity. "Stand," she commanded softly. The stallion hesitated, his ears flickering back. He shifted his haunches, the massive muscles of his chest rippling beneath the black velvet of his coat. There was a moment of terrifying uncertainty, a second where the entire month of labor hung in the balance of a single mechanical movement. Then, with a slow, powerful heave, the horse pushed himself upward. His hooves met the wooden floorboards with a sound like a muffled drumbeat. He did not stumble. He did not favor the left foreleg. Bellerophon stood foursquare in the center of the stall, his head held high, his breathing a steady, triumphant cadence. The geometry was perfect. The bone held. Arthur felt a shiver of pure, cold awe. He looked at Sarah, who was now standing, her hand still resting on the stallion's neck. She did not smile. She did not weep with relief. She simply looked at the horse's eye, checking for the contraction of the pupil, her mind already updating the ledger of his recovery. She had achieved the impossible, and she treated it with the quiet dignity of a clerk who had successfully balanced a difficult account. The silence of the triumph was shattered by the sudden, aggressive pounding of hoofbeats in the yard. It was not the rhythmic trot of a lone traveler, but the chaotic, heavy arrival of a dozen horses. The sound of metal shoes striking the frozen mud of the Penhaligon boundary was followed immediately by the shouting of men and the clinking of harnessed chains. The world of social protocols and legal vengeance had finally breached the sanctuary of the stable. The tranquility of the restoration was gone, replaced by the jagged reality of the law. Sarah did not flinch. She did not move to hide the horse. She stood her ground, her spine assuming its habitual, rigid alignment as the stable door was kicked open with a violent force that sent a shower of dust and hay from the rafters. The cold morning air rushed in, smelling of iron and damp earth. Lord Percival Thorns stepped into the dim light, his presence a jagged intrusion of aristocratic vanity. He was dressed in a riding coat of deep scarlet, the color of fresh blood, his boots polished to a mirror shine that mocked the dirty straw of the floor. Behind him stood Geoffrey Higgins, the Duke's valet, his face a mask of high-strung anxiety and protocol, his fingers twitching at his waistcoat. Behind them both were 4 men of the local watch, armed with heavy staves and the blunt authority of the magistrate. "There she is," Thorn announced, his voice a sharp, arrogant bark that caused the stallion to toss his head in alarm. "The girl who thinks the moors belong to her father's ghost. And look, Higgins, the beast is here, exactly as the reports suggested, maimed and hidden in a hovel like a common piece of stolen tack." Thorn did not look at the horse's posture. He did not see the clean lines of the leg or the health in the animal's eye. He saw only the ruined dress of the woman and the drafty stable, and he immediately projected his own incompetence onto the scene. He walked forward, the scent of his expensive cologne, a cloying mixture of sandalwood and musk, filling the air and clashing with the honest sense of the stable. "Sarah Penhaligon," Thorn said, his lip curling in a sneer of profound social dismissal. "You are under arrest for the theft and the subsequent maiming of a high-value thoroughbred belonging to the Duke of Moreland. You thought you could hide your crimes in the mist, but the law has a long memory and a sharp eye." Sarah did not lower her gaze. She did not offer a frantic defense or a plea for mercy. She stood beside the stallion, her hand still grounding him, her posture radiating a sovereignty that Thorn could not comprehend and therefore sought to destroy. "The horse is not maimed, Lord Thorn," Sarah replied, her voice perfectly level, carrying the resonance of an absolute truth. "He is restored. If you had the intellect to look at the animal instead of the woman, you would see that the cannon bone has knitted with more precision than any doctor in your circle could manage. He was found in a ravine, dying of a fracture and a fever. I have not stolen him. I have saved him from the incompetence of those who lost him." Thorn laughed, a dry, metallic sound that echoed against the stone walls. He gestured to the watchman, his fingers twitching with the desire to exert his meager power. He looked at the stallion and saw only a broken tool, failing to recognize the vital strength in the animal's stance. "You speak of medicine as if it were a language you were permitted to learn," Thorn countered, stepping closer into her personal space, his shadow falling over her. "You are the daughter of a disgraced man, living in a ruin. To the law, you are a thief who has tampered with the Duke's property. Do you honestly believe the magistrate will listen to your talk of bone and geometry? You have scarred a champion with a hot iron. You have held him in filth. For that, you will see the inside of a cell. And this beast will be returned to the Morland estate to be put out of its misery." Geoffrey Higgins stepped forward, his eyes darting frantically between the horse and the girl. "Lord Thorn is right. The Duke has been in a state of cold fury. To find the horse in such a state, in such a place, it is a scandal that cannot be ignored. The Duke will have your head for this, girl. He does not tolerate the meddling of commoners in his affairs." Sarah felt the weight of their judgment, a heavy, suffocating pressure of class and arrogance. She looked at the men who valued the horse's price, but could not see its life. She did not look at Arthur, who remained in the shadows of the tack room, his presence unnoticed by the intruders who saw only what they expected to see, a girl and a stolen horse. "The Duke of Morland values results, does he not?" Sarah asked, her voice sharpening with a rare edge of defiance. "If he is the man the stories claim, he would rather have a horse that can stand than a carcass in a ravine. I have provided him with a miracle. If you arrest me now, you are arresting the only person who can manage the final stage of his recovery. To move him now, under the clumsy hands of your watchman, would be the true crime." Thorn's face reddened, the veins in his neck bulging with suppressed rage. He could not stand the way she looked at him, with the calm, analytical gaze of a superior mind. He reached out as if to grab her arm, his movements lacking any of the grace she had cultivated in her solitude. "Enough of this peasant's logic," Thorn shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his own indignation. "Seize her, and get a halter on that animal. We take them both to the magistrate's house. If the horse collapses on the road, it is merely more evidence of her brutality and lack of care." The watchmen moved forward, their heavy boots tramping through the straw Sarah had meticulously cleaned. They did not see the masterpiece she had created. They saw only the order of their social better. Sarah Penhaligon did not struggle. She did not scream, she did not beg. She simply tightened her grip on the stallion's neck. For one last second, her spine perfectly straight, her dignity intact as the world sought to crush her once more. "The ledger of this day will not be balanced by your arrogance, Lord Thorn," Sarah said, her voice a quiet promise that cut through the noise of the boots and the clanking iron. She did not look back as they led her toward the door. She did not cry out for help. She walked with the poise of a queen being led to a private reckoning. Her mind already calculating the next move in a game Thorn did not even realize he was playing. In the shadows of the tack room, Arthur St. Maur watched his world collide with hers, his grey eyes cold with a decision that would soon shatter the peace of the entire county. The architect had finished her work, and now the Duke would have to decide if he was a man of the law or a man of the truth. The stable was no longer a sanctuary. It was the starting line of a war that would prove, once and for all, where the true peerage lay. As the door slammed shut, the silence that followed was not one of defeat, but the heavy, expectant pause before a storm. The iron grip of the watchman was not a gesture of law. It was a physical insult to the skin, a bruising reminder of a world that valued the enclosure of bodies over the healing of bones. Sarah Penhaligon did not struggle against the heavy wool sleeve of the guard. She did not plead with the arrogance of Lord Percival Thorn, nor did she cast her eyes downward in the performative shame expected of a woman in her position. Instead, she looked at the mud on the boots of Thorn, a wet, chaotic splash of northern clay that spoke of a man who rode for vanity rather than for the stewardship of the land. She counted the seconds of her own breathing, measuring the cold intake of the morning air against the frantic, uneven pulse of the watchman. The stable yard was no longer a place of restoration. It had become a theatre of social execution, and Sarah Penhaligon was the designated sacrifice. "Seize her," Thorn commanded, his voice a sharp, jagged edge in the mist, "and do not be gentle. The justice of the Duke is as cold as the Moors, and the Duke will not thank us for treating a thief with the delicacy of a lady." The watchmen began to pull her toward the gate, the heavy heels of their boots dragging through the meticulously cleaned straw. The spine of Sarah Penhaligon remained a perfect vertical line. She looked one last time at Bellerophon. The stallion's head was high, his ears pinned back. He understood the violence of the intruders, even if he could not comprehend the syntax of their laws. To Sarah, the horse was not a beast of burden. It was a testament to a brilliance Thorn could never possess. "Release her." The words were not shouted. They did not carry the hysterical pitch of the anger of Lord Percival Thorn or the high-strung panic of Geoffrey Higgins. The command was a low, vibrating resonance that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the stable. The imposing noble stepped out of the shadows of the tack room, the heavy charcoal cloak swirling around his boots like a gathering storm. He was no longer the bedraggled traveler with a broken carriage. As he moved into the pale light of the dawn, the posture of the Duke assumed a terrifying ancient authority that silenced the yard. Thorn froze, his hand still raised in a gesture of command. He looked at the nobleman. He saw only the stranger who had dared to interrupt the execution of his will. "Who are you to interfere with a magistrate's arrest?" Thorn demanded, though a flicker of uncertainty had already begun to bleed into his tone. "This is a matter of the property of the Duke, and I suggest you step aside before you are counted among the accomplices of this girl." Arthur St. Maur did not look at Thorn. He did not grant the man the dignity of a direct gaze. Instead, the Duke walked towards Sarah Penhaligon, his steps measured and rhythmic. He looked at the watchman's hand on her arm. The rough, calloused grip was not just a physical touch. It was a violation of the order she had spent a month building. "I am the man whose horse you are currently mishandling," the estate's lord said, his voice as cold and precise as the silver probe. "And I am the man who is currently auditing your incompetence, Lord Thorn. It is a significant debt, and I find the interest to be quite high." Geoffrey Higgins gave a choked, strangled sound. The face of the valet turned a shade of grey that matched the morning fog. He dropped to his knees in the wet straw, his hands trembling violently. "The Duke," Higgins whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the wind. We feared the Moors had taken you. We did not know." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum of power that Thorn could not fill. The watchman, sensing the sudden shift in the hierarchy, released the arm of Sarah Penhaligon as if it were made of white-hot iron. They backed away, their staves lowering, their heads bowing in an instinctive, primitive recognition of the true peerage. The face of Lord Percival Thorn shifted from a vibrant scarlet to a pale, sickly yellow. He looked at the Duke, then at Sarah, and finally at the stallion that stood foursquare and healthy in the center of the yard. The logic of his world was collapsing. His accusations had been built on her presumed ruin and the absence of the estate's master, and now both foundations had turned to dust. "The Duke," Thorn stammered, his voice losing its arrogant edge and becoming a thin, desperate whine. I was merely protecting your interests." The girl had hidden the animal. She had used an iron cautery on him. You believed what your own lack of skill dictated," the Duke interjected, his grey eyes finally meeting those of Thorn with the intensity of a winter gale. "You saw a fracture and called it a carcass. You saw a nurse and called her a thief. You have spent a month scouring the moors with 50 riders, while this woman has spent a month in the mud, performing a miracle of restoration that you cannot even comprehend." The Duke stepped toward Bellerophon, his hand resting on the neck of the stallion with a familiarity that needed no explanation. The horse leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been tested and proven. "The procedure you called brutality was the only thing that prevented sepsis," he continued. "The timber braces you called maiming were the only things that held the bone's geometry together. I have watched her work, Thorn. I have watched her audit the biology of this animal with a precision that makes your laws look like the scribblings of a child. You did not find the horse. You found a master. And because she owned nothing but her mind, you sought to destroy her." Sarah Penhaligon stood perfectly still. She did not gloat. She did not smile at the public humiliation of Thorn. She maintained the quiet, solitary strategy of perseverance that had defined her life. She looked at Arthur St. Maur, the man who was no longer just a traveler, but a duke whose word could rewrite her history. She did not see a savior. She saw a partner in the stewardship of the bone. "Lead your men and leave this yard," the duke commanded, the finality of the statement echoing against the cottage walls. "You are dismissed from any involvement with the moorland stables," Or your ignorance is a liability I can no longer afford. And Higgins, get up. You will arrange for a carriage to be sent here immediately. Not for me, for the steward. Lord Percival Thorne did not attempt a final defense. He turned and fled the yard, his watchman following him in a disorganized, shameful retreat. The sound of their horses faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the stallion and the steady ticking of the clock inside the cottage. Arthur St. Maur turned to Sarah Penhaligon. He did not offer her a hand. He did not treat her with the condescending pity of a lord toward a subject. He stood before her, his posture mirroring the straightness of her own spine. The ledger of the Moorland estate is in a state of profound imbalance. Sarah Penhaligon, the Duke said, his voice softening but losing none of its authority. We have a vacancy for the position of Royal Equine Steward, a role that has been held by men of pedigree for 3 centuries. But pedigree did not save my horse in the ravine. Labor did. Intellect did. He reached into his cloak and withdrew a small silver key, not a literal key to a lock, but a symbol of a new contract. I am moving Bellerophon to Moorland this morning, he said. But he will not go unless his architect follows. I offer you a kingdom of stone and straw, an infirmary built to the specifications of your father, and a salary to ensure you never have to count the grains of your own mash again. I do not offer this out of gratitude. I offer it because the Moorland stables cannot survive without your logic. Sarah Penhaligon looked at the key, then at the man who had seen her in the shadows, and chosen to stay in the straw. She did not hesitate. She wouldn't let the memory of the disgrace of her father to act as a weight on her future. She realized that the initial humiliation, the years of isolation and the poverty of the cottage, had not been a tragedy. It had been the forge that had sharpened her skill into a weapon of sovereignty. I shall require my father's thick, leather-bound ledger to be moved first, Sarah Penhaligon replied, her voice level and dignified. And I shall require absolute authority over the technical requirements of the patients. The geometry of the bone does not accept the interference of politics, Arthur St. Maur. The Duke bowed slightly, a gesture of intellectual respect that finalized the agreement. The bone shall be your law, Sarah Penhaligon. I ask only that you continue to teach me its grammar. The journey to the Moorland estate was a matter of transit, not of emotion. Sarah Penhaligon sat in the fine velvet interior of the carriage of the Duke, her father's meticulously written ledger resting on her lap like a sacred contract. She did not look at the luxury of the silk hangings, nor did she marvel at the speed of the matched pair of greys pulling them. She watched the landscape change from the grey, jagged rocks of the moors to the lush, ordered green of the great valley. The restoration of her life was beginning, 1 mile at a time. The carriage was not a literal vehicle. It was a bridge between the ruin of her past and the architecture of her future. When they reached the gates of Moorland, the servants were lined up in a silent, high-formal row. They did not see a peasant girl in a ruined dress. They saw a woman who walked with the poise of a scholar, a woman whose name had already begun to circulate as the savior of the prized stallion of Arthur St. Maur. Thomas Miller was there among the grooms, his face weathering a look of profound relief and quiet pride. He stepped forward to take the reins of the lead horse, his eyes meeting Sarah's for a fleeting second. It was a silent acknowledgement between those who had known the weight of the labor. The Duke led her directly to the stables, a massive, vaulted structure of white stone that smelled of fresh hay and cedar. The air inside was cool and regulated, a stark contrast to the damp, drafty stalls of Penhaligon Cottage. At the far end, in a stall that had been prepared with the meticulous care Sarah Penhaligon had taught the staff during the final days of recovery, stood Bellerophon. The horse whinnied as they approached, a sound of profound contentment that resonated through the high ceilings. Sarah Penhaligon walked to a small oak desk at the entrance of the infirmary. On it sat a brand-new ledger, its leather cover smelling of oil and promise. Beside it lay her silver probe and the remains of the last comfrey poultice, brought from the cottage as a reminder of the foundation. She took a pen, dipped it into the fresh ink, and opened the first page. She did not write her feelings. She did not record her triumph over Thorne. She focused on the tangible reality of the animal. She wrote, Day 30, patient Bellerophon. Status, structural integrity restored. Weight bearing on left foreleg, 100%. Treatment, monitoring of local circulation and light exercise on level ground. The geometry is in balance. She watched the ink as it dried on the page, a sharp, black mark against the white parchment. Ledger of the Penhaligon name was finally in perfect balance. She had been given a ruin, and she had built a kingdom. She had been given an insult, and she had transformed it into a title. Arthur St. Maur stood in the doorway, watching her work. He did not interrupt the silence of her labor. He understood that she didn't require his voice to validate her worth. She was the architect of her own dignity, and as she closed the book with a soft final click, the stable settled into a state of ordered peace. The work was done. The solitary discipline of endurance had become a public testament to power, and for the first time in her life, Sarah Penhaligon was not just visible, she was essential. She turned toward the stalls, her spine perfectly straight, her mind already calculating the requirements of the next recovery. The world was finally whole, measured not by the length of a title, but by the chiming of the hours and the steady rhythm of a healing heart.